Well, there were some changes, but not as big changes as people think. Yes, Stalin was condemned. The prisoners, thousands of them, millions of them were released. But the system as such didn't change dramatically. And the best proof of it is the suppression of Hungarian Revolution in 1956, which was done in the best traditions of Stalin. Khrushchev saw affected literature, some novels, stories were published at that time, which otherwise in a previous time couldn't be published. So Solzhenitsyn was published in 1963 for the first time officially in the Soviet Union. But that was the limit of it. It was still done under control of the party. It was not a free press, a free publication. It still was a propaganda, communist propaganda, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. It still was the same economic system. It still was a repressive system which would imprison people for speaking publicly against the regime as such.
Why the Stalin is still cherished as a great leader, not as some kind of barbarian?
Well, he is not challenged by the population, by the society, but the current government, the current rulers in Russia, they all belong to KGB and small officers of KGB who still nostalgic for the greatness of the Soviet Empire, for the achievements of Stalin, who could take half of Europe. For them, it's a nostalgic feeling of greatness, of influence, of importance. You see, they never understood that the Soviet regime was doomed. As we understood, even I'm at 16 knew that it's going to disappear one day. And they never understood it. And when it collapsed, they presumed it's some kind of subversive activity. CIA, some Zionists, some foreigners, something like that. So they still believe that if they recreate Soviet Union today, it will be glorious and great and influential. It was a horrible time. After the war, I remember it. I was a small kid, but I remember it. First of all, the repressions started much bigger than they were during the war. During the war, they had to fight in the front lines. They didn't have time for repressions. So suddenly there was a cosmopolitan campaign against Jews, campaign against intellectuals. Everyone who was in captivity as prisoners of war in German camps had to go through Soviet concentration camps. And a huge quantity of people living under German occupation in the territories occupied of Germany also had to go through filtration camps to be established how much they cooperated with Germany. Yes, so that was a horrible time for Soviet people. Plus, don't forget, the country was completely destroyed. We were living hungry. In 1947, I remember we had to stay in line for flour, to make bread. There was no bread, flour. And we had to stay in line for several days. And I remember I was only, 5-year-old, and my grandmother took me with her to stand in these lines because they would give you so much into one hand. So she would take me as a second person to get equal amount of that flour. And in order to, for us to remember the order of this line, they would put you a number with indelible pencil on your palm. I was actually pleased because, kids, they dislike washing hands. So with this number, I would say, no, I can't wash hands.
Nie byłem nawet z tego troszkę zadowolony, bo...
Preserve a number. So all in all, it was very repressive, very hard time. And people didn't feel like winners at all. It wasn't victory for people, definitely. People were pleased that the war is over. It was enormous relief. Such a destruction, so much people killed and so on. So they were relieved that the war is over, but they didn't feel themselves victors at all.
Ordinary people during Brezhnev
Well,
period.
to begin with, it was very boring. There was nothing happening. For young people growing at that time in the country, there was nothing to do at all. There was no particular entertainment. You could go officially to some kind of concerts and whatever, but they were boring. It was hopeless. No one would expect anything to improve. There were shortages of everything. Bread, at least, was available for a while. Yeah, but already meat or sausage, that was something you had to queue for and stand in line for. So mostly people, even ordinary people, those who were not particularly interested in politics, just to have some information, would listen to foreign broadcasts, to BBC Russian Service, Voice of America, Radio Liberty, and so on and so forth. And all the authorities would jam it you still could manage to get through and to listen to at least something, to know what's going on in the world.
What was your activity then?
Oh, I was in jail already. I was in jail 4 times. Altogether, in sum, it will be something like 12 years. So we started as a small group of young people organizing poetry reading, mostly of the poets who were executed under Stalin or forbidden. That gave the rise, emergence of samizdat, the self-publication system, which later became massive in the country. Mm-hmm. So that's how the human rights movement in the Soviet Union started, which grew very rapidly throughout the 60s. By 1968, it was quite a considerable movement in the country. The number of people who would openly challenge the authority was not that big. It probably was 3,000 across the country, but they were quite prominent people. I mean, there were members of academy, there were like Sakharov. But that was only visible part of it. Invisible part, we don't know how many people were. For example, those who were engaged in printing and distributing samizdat. How many hundreds of thousands of people were involved in it, we don't know.
So what is the gist of communism?
It is ideology, almost a religion, which is forced on people who might disbelieve it completely, but who would be forced to pretend that they believe it. Everything in the country had to be done according to this ideology. All the structures of a country, all campaigns they conducted, they were all verified according to ideology. Anyone who would object to that ideology was considered to be a especially dangerous state criminal. So, plus, don't forget that it also means that the owner of every enterprise in the country is a state. You don't have private property. So, wherever you work for the state. And if you do something against the state, they can actually bar you from any job. So you go and die of hunger. So communism is a system of total ideological control of every sphere of life. It's an ideology of extreme collectivism, where individual will denied.
So who took advantages and who was proud of it? Because it seems so sinister, but some people were proud and took advantages.
Well, mostly people who were incapable of becoming good professionals. You know, if you're a gifted person in your own sphere of activity, of performance, of life, of work, you don't need the party. You can actually achieve something. You will become important worker in your own field. But for the ungifted, incapable, for them, the system gives an advantage. If they join the party, they become the bosses. There was a very good joke in the 60s that 3 qualities cannot coexist in the same individual: intelligence, honesty, and membership in Communist Party. So you either have a clever bastard or complete imbecile in the party, nothing else.
So the system was doomed to collapse. Why it lasts so long and why it couldn't exist longer?
Well, to begin with, only some people understood that it's bound to collapse. Those on the top, they didn't understand it till 80s. A lot of people at the beginning believed it's a new political system which is destined to make the mankind happy. It will remove all the contradictions, eliminate all the hostilities in the world, and the people will be living happily ever after. That was utopians, and they were at the beginning. At the time when I was living in the Soviet Union, there were no utopians anymore. It was obviously a very unproductive, very awkward system, very wasteful system, which couldn't exist in any other country but in Russia, because Russia is an incredibly rich country. Russia is still incredibly rich after being plundered for 73 years, and plus 10 years after it. It still has plenty of oil, gas, gold, diamonds, timber, coal, iron, whatever you call it. And if you try to introduce that system in any small country, it will be dead within a month. I remember the joke at the time, what will happen if they introduce socialism in Sahara Desert? Yeah, the first thing, the sand disappeared.
Zabraknie piasku.
Incredible system. When you read the documents of Central Committee, you can see, for example, that they are quite capable of creating a revolution on another side of the globe but they couldn't provide its own population with bread or even with table salt. It is. I mean, in the 80s, they investigated shortages of table salt in Russia. And I saw the documents of Central Committee. Politburo was trying to understand, why do we have shortage of salt? Salt in Russia is produced by excavators in huge lakes. It's loaded on the trains, and then the trains go off. It's so much of salt, you can provide the whole world with the salt. And yet, people would have shortage of salt. For a year, Central Committee investigates what happens with salt, why we have shortage of salt, and they couldn't find the answer. But at the same time, they knew how to suppress solidarity in Poland, how to invade Afghanistan, they knew how to make revolution in one or another country. The country was made specifically for export of communist revolution. That was its purpose of existence. And that's what it existed for. When Lenin made this so-called revolution in Russia, he actually believed that within 2-3 years, the entire world will follow. And it was a big shock for him in 1921 when he discovered that there is no world revolution. Stalin also believed that they will export the revolution on the bayonets of Red Army. Yeah, and by 1945 he understood he failed. For him, the victory over Germany was not a victory. He wanted the whole Western world. And what he got, a dozen of countries in Central Europe, that was not his purpose. This is why when they had the victory parade in Red Square, Stalin did not command this parade. He sent Zhukov. I found the minutes of Politburo meeting in October 1988, where Gorbachev says, we are entering a very sensitive period of our perestroika. What will happen if we have a crisis simultaneously in several East European countries? What if we have a bankruptcy in Hungary, another general strike by solidarity in Poland, and something Charter 77 does in Czechoslovakia? And he says, we will be caught in a very wrong position. We would not be able to send the troops because our perestroika is deliberately done without the violence and without applying force, and yet we cannot accept this kind of changes. So we have to find a way, comrades, he said, how to distance ourselves from these problems and make them less painful for us if they happen. So he ordered his colleagues in Politburo to work out a decision what to do, and to report it on the meeting of Politburo in January of 1989. Now, that decision of January 1989, I never found. But there are some indirect indications of what it was. It was a decision to make, to simulate revolutions in Eastern Europe. And it was decided to do that through the channels of KGB. We know, for example, that in charge of this operation was General Grushko, deputy head of intelligence department of KGB. And he did that through intelligence departments of these countries, not through the internal KGB, because intelligence department is somewhat different and a thing apart. The KGB could leak that out to their party bosses. The intelligence department wouldn't. So that's why it was done. So. In Czechoslovakia, for example, General Lawrence of Czech security, who was in charge of Czech intelligence service, was in charge of what was happening in Czechoslovakia. And what he did, they have organized, through their channels, some unrest among students. And the police was ordered to suppress it. As a result of suppression, ostensibly, one student was killed. When the Czech government, after it, under Václav Havel, investigated it, they discovered that this young fellow, A, was not a student, but a young KGB officer, and B, he is pretty much alive. He testified in the governmental investigation in Czechoslovakia. But that was sufficient cause of unrest in the country, and the previous government, with Yakish as its head, had to resign. So they had a period of meetings and discussions, but the Soviet candidate to replace it was Mlynar, not Havel. They didn't want Havel. And Mlynar came. Mlynar was living in Vienna after 1968. He was one of the young members of Czech Politburo under Dubček. And in 1968 had to run away to the West. He also was a friend of Gorbachev since years of students in MGU, in Moscow State University. So he was warned in advance, before it all happened in Czechoslovakia, that Moscow wants him to become a next leader. So after Yakish collapsed, he returned to Czechoslovakia, made a speech to the crowd in Wenceslav Square, but he couldn't say to them anything but exactly what they used to say in 1968 about socialism with human face and how marvelous it will be. By that time, no one in Czechoslovakia wanted socialism, with or without human face. So people booed and whistled at him, and he turned around and went back to Vienna. As a result, Havel became president. That was not what Moscow wanted. This is all very well documented in the West. I mean, I don't need to find any documents in archives. That was investigated by John Simpson of the BBC, and he made a documentary about all that.
So in Poland it was going rather according to the Soviet plan, because the first prime minister was Kiszczak and president Jaruzelski.
Well, in 1988, Polish leadership sent an envoy to Gorbachev where they explained to him the plan of round table. I found the minutes of negotiations between, I forgot who it was, Chosek or someone. Chosek. I think so, but I don't remember exactly. And Gorbachev, at the beginning, was a bit worried, and he asked, are you sure you'll manage to keep control, to maintain control? Aren't you afraid that these people will become too popular? He questioned the Polish side for quite a time. But finally, at the end, he said, all right, if you're so sure you can succeed, yes, go ahead. So I have this document, this transcript of a conversation, and also subsequent conversations between Jaruzelski and Gorbachev, Rakovsky and Gorbachev, Mazowiecki and Gorbachev. And I gave it to my publisher here in Poland, who published Moskovsky Process, Moscow, Adam Borowski of Volumen. He said he is going to publish it at the anniversary of Solidarity.
What is the main direction of integration of EU?
Well, that's what this book is about, which we just published with Tomic. And it's also based on the secret documents of Politburo. And what it transpires, that by the middle of 80s, the left in the West and the Soviet leaders understood that socialism as such is in crisis. They had to find a way of salvaging socialism. And one of the ideas they all kind of agreed on is that if they take over European project and turn it upside down, that will help them to salvage socialism. If before that time we had the just common market in Europe, a trade arrangement for freedom of movement of goods and labor and capitals in Europe, but there was no attempt of creating a federal state or bureaucracy. They decided that if they take over this project, they will make it a federal state. And that will help them forever to establish their values, their ideology, because the structure is not democratic. Right from the beginning, they understood that if Soviet Union would become milder, a milder version of communism, more of socialism, and the Western Europe will become social democratic, then they would have what they called convergency. This is why the European structures, when it happened, are so remarkably similar to the structures of the Soviet Union. Structurally, they are very much alike. That was deliberate in order to have these two structures fitting each other. This is why Gorbachev could conduct this operation in Central Europe and Eastern Europe with so-called phony revolution, because this region would have been forever sandwiched between the socialist European Union and the Soviet Union. That was a devilish plan. You know, if you want to run away from Soviet influence, you go to the West, without even thinking that they're already in agreement. Well, the eastern part of that building collapsed, as we know, but the western part continued to build exactly on the same lines. They didn't change anything. And today, when you join the European Union, you are actually joining a milder version of the Soviet Union.
Profesjonalny eksport rewolucji.
Professional export of revolution.
Well, it's more than that. I mean, it's kind of a manipulation of the whole number of countries. Yeah, I quote Mitterrand, Monsieur Mitterrand, the French president, when the Soviet Union was already almost collapsing, he was very keen on supporting it. He didn't want it to collapse. And he explains, he explains to Gorbachev in 1991, a few months before it collapsed. He explained, we need very strong Soviet Union in the East in order to control all the countries which are between us.
So why socialism must persist?
Well, it's very convenient for a huge number of people who otherwise would hardly be successful in life. Look at these commissars in Europe, in Brussels. They're like our members of Politburo. They live in paradise. They earn huge amount of money. They don't pay tax. They have immunity from prosecution for life, so they can steal as much as they wish. They have incredible power over the whole continent and no responsibility. And look who is appointed to these commissars. The most incapable people. Jacques Delors was such a disastrous Minister of Finances that even socialist government had to sack him. Neil Kinnock from Britain, the leader of Labour Party, was such a disastrous Labour Party leader that he couldn't win elections 3 times on end. At the end, he became a commissar in Europe. We have Peter Mandelson in British government, personal friend of Tony Blair, who was so corrupt. He was caught 3 times on corruption, being minister of different ministers. There were 3 scandals. Finally, he was made a commissar in Brussels, and so on and so forth. Romano Prodi was a disastrous politician in Italy, completely incapable. He became European commissar, and so on and so forth. You look at them. They're the most incapable people. They probably wouldn't earn anything in their life if you wouldn't give them a position of some kind of socialist commissar. Well, all this socialist experimentation in Europe, like it was in the Soviet Union, created a special nomenclatura. Hundreds of thousands of bureaucrats who are incapable of doing anything but to distribute somebody else's wealth. So, do you expect them to give it away? No. They don't care about people. They don't care what will happen to Poland or to England or to France. They care about themselves. Economic model adopted by European Union is somewhat different from the Soviet. This is because the whole concept of socialism after the 1980s went into a transformation. If previously private ownership was blamed for all the ills on earth, so from the beginning of the 80s, end of the 80s, that is changed. The property, private ownership is not forbidden anymore. But the model will be more close to the Swedish model of socialism, where they never had nationalization. They retained the private ownership of production, but they had incredibly high taxes. So that is a northern, as they call it, northern model of socialism, which European Union adopted. Well, it's a long story. It's a family legend. Some of my ancestors, one of my ancestors, took part in the Kostyushka uprising and was exiled to Russia. First he was exiled to Siberia, but then was allowed to settle in the central part of Russia, and he settled in Tambov district. That small town from which my father is originated, at least half of population have the same name, Bukovsky. So that Szlachtich must have been very successful in proliferating. So well, there is no need to create a federal state in Europe. Why don't you have a common market? By 1980s, we already had a fully integrated common market in Europe. We didn't need to go further. So why don't we return to that stage? To the stage before the left wing took over the whole project and turned it upside down. There is nothing wrong in free trade and movement of goods and capital across the border. That's fine. What we don't need is a federal bureaucratic structure which would govern everyone.